Ladies and gentlemen, this evening on The Unconventional Pastor, Bob Greaves continues his discussion on Luke and how he views things differently. Can you believe it? The Unconventional Pastor views Luke differently. An explanation on that in just a moment on The Unconventional Pastor.
Good evening. My name is Bob Greaves, and they call me the Unconventional Pastor. And I'll tell you, every time I hear that song, I just don't get tired of it. I had a lot of fun. Some of you may not know it, but that's me on the MIDI drums and on the keyboard and on the bass and on the guitar. I put that together. Had a lot of fun doing it, and when I hear it again, it's like, wow, that was fun doing that, and it makes me wish I had more time to even do more of that. And in fact, I'm hoping that it'll come up soon, and I'll get some more time to put some music together in the studio of my own. And perhaps some of you, most of you should know this by now, that that although they call me the Unconventional Pastor, the truth is, working in ministry is something that I used to do a long time ago, and that currently I'm actually a professor of sound engineering at a college, and so that this is for me just a pastime and a hobby. Although I have a great deal of fun doing this, one of the main ways that I pay the bills is by teaching at a college. And stuff that has nothing to do with Jesus necessarily. Anyway, so tonight I wanted to continue talking from the book of Luke. And again, I if I can briefly do this, when I do hesitate to talk about biblical passages, because very often people hear discussing of biblical passages hyper religiously. It's hard sometimes to talk about a biblical passage without either sounding like you're completely throwing the thing away or sounding like you're completely standing behind everything that we have traditionally thought this text was telling us, and it's kind of hard to read it and look at it and try to understand it as literature, and also understand that there may be dynamics going on here that may be or may not be true, that we can't necessarily know with certainty. So it does make it difficult sometimes, I think. One of the reasons why I avoid many times taking specific verses from the Bible and talking about them on this show. I think that we've had so much of this from a traditional manner stashed down our throats that it's sometimes hard to deal with it just simply for what it is. And what is it? Well, we're dealing with it to explore it, to discover, to find out what it is. And not so sure that sort of discovery ever really leads to anything with finality. I'm sure it doesn't. But anyhow, so I do this with some intrepidation. The other thing is I want to share with you somewhat how I came to change some of the views that I had about Jesus without necessarily losing faith. In fact, some people ask me if I'm a Christian, and I found that more recently I have grown so uncomfortable with the label that there's a sense in what I think of what would be wonderful if the word meant, that I could identify as a Christian. But when I realized the way that word fits the label of people, I find myself, well, I don't want to be in that group. And I don't even identify with a lot of the things that go on with people who put themselves in that group. And I would not want to be confused with them. And even not necessarily in a sense where I don't like them. Many Christians I really do like as people. And I can even appreciate and understand where they're coming from, what they think. But but it is not where I'm at. And so I've more often, or more recently, I should say, kind of referred to myself as a Jesuist. And every time I say that, people say, "Oh, a Jesuit." No, 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 a Jesuist. It's a different thing. It's basically, it's a very broad term. It doesn't really nail anything down to the ground. It's you could use the word Jesuist to describe anybody who, at any level, be it complete or partial, just admires who Jesus is and his teachings and the influence that he can or does have. And that would certainly describe me. Now, but I began to shift radically the way that I understand the Bible, the way I understand Jesus, the way I understand God, back at a time in my life when, oddly enough, I actually had a what you call it, near death, you could call it out of body, you could call it a vision, an experience that I went through. And I hopefully, if I can say this, if I can brag on myself, an intelligent enough person to know that after this experience, that the experience did not necessarily nail anything down to the ground or to the floor. I had an experience. It was a vision. Does that mean it was really a vision? No. Does it mean it wasn't? No. What does it mean in terms of what really happened? As far as I'm concerned, absolutely nothing. It was an experience I had. I can't explain it. I don't need to explain it. I certainly had it as an experience. And for me, that's good enough. And I realized that that's all I could do with it. And I also realized there was danger in trying to deny it as reality or in trying to assert it as reality. I don't know. And there's a part of me that, in a sense, it doesn't even care. Okay, so it happened. But I found that I was very hesitant to talk about it. In fact, it's only recently that I've even begun talking about it more often. I'd say for almost, well, it happened, if I can recall correctly, happened somewhere around 77, 78, if I'm looking back. And I would say that I probably went sometimes as much as 20 years not even mentioning it to anybody, because I didn't like the way people responded to it. To me, it seemed they were completely led astray by it for me to even talk about it. There would be either the people who would look at me and think, "Oh, you're schizophrenic. You're one of these people with some serious hallucinatory problems," or they would look at me with an almost kind of envy, like, "Oh, you actually talk to God, and and to me, both of those are to me so completely irrelevant to the experience that I found it, for the most part, really just useless to talk about it. It did nothing for me. It did nothing for anybody else. It just is an experience that I'd had. But part of the way that affected me in terms of radically changing my theology is because I wrestled with the fact that there is nothing I could do with that vision. Not a thing. Nothing. And so that therefore, whatever it really was has to be, for me, for all practical purposes of being responsible, it has to be absolutely nothing. Because there's nothing I could responsibly do with it. It became, for me, clearly what had to be a non-issue. It was, I couldn't deny the experience, but as to defining the experience and determining exactly what it was, its level of legitimacy, that had to be, for me, completely a non-issue, totally irrelevant. And anybody who wanted to turn it into an issue was somebody who I thought was chasing after something that could not be ever nailed down to the ground, and they were therefore chasing after it for purposes that served them as Greg and I were talking about earlier, certain biases, and therefore it was a useless thing to talk about. But it did change the way I'm thinking about Jesus. For one thing, it made me realize that it is impossible to know if there is or is not a God. It's impossible to know. It even got me to the point where I developed, and I won't talk about it in today's program, a multi dimensional argument for arguing about how, from our standpoint of experience in 3 dimensions plus time, it is impossible for us to differentiate anything that happens outside of our dimensional awareness from something that can happen inside of it and explained entirely within it. And I came up with a variety of mathematical demonstrations that show how impossible it is to differentiate that, because the real logic and the real proof of what's going on outside of our dimension that interacts with our dimension can only be observed from the standpoint of the dimensions in which it's actually occurring, not just the dimensions in which it has an impact. And so I came to the point where I realized the entire question is useless. It is meaningless. I cannot prove there's a God. Nobody can prove there isn't a God. And so therefore, the question itself is in some ways useless. I don't need to ask the question. I don't need to be afraid of the question. I can even answer the question with what I am comfortable with and realize that that's all that I've answered it with, is a level of comfort. And I can't pretend that it is anything that I can deal with solidly. And I can also, in a sense, know that anybody else who thinks they're dealing with a question in a manner of solidarity is really, in my opinion, kind of fooling themselves into thinking that it is such a solidly answered question. I don't think it is. And as a result, I also realized that it affected me in a manner where the question also struck me as being one that had to be irrelevant to life. Totally irrelevant. So I could not, it changed my sense of being able to even believe in a God where it was somehow necessary to even believe in him. I couldn't see how that would even be a part of spiritual life. So the truth is that it brought me face to face with a conundrum that I realized was irresolvable. And doing that, it forced me in a very real way to begin to look at the biblical text and to begin to wonder if that irresolvableness was also revealed in the text or talked about in the text, or is this text just something that, like a lot of old superstition, comes across with just this adamancy and dogmaticism that claims that, oh, no, this stuff is true, this is real, and you have to believe it. Which is often the way that preachers, such as myself back in that day, I was quite a strong fundamentalist, would often do. And we translate the text and we interpret the text in a way that fits within this concept of external authority, as if this is exactly the purpose that the text exists for. And I would have to say that upon considering that as a possibility, I went back to the text and I found that indeed, and I could no longer see the text as even necessarily trying to do that. In fact, in sharing with you some of the things I see in the text, and I'm really talking about it in a sense in terms of properly understanding the literature and the story that it's telling, irrespective of whether or not there's anything about this story that is true or not true. That's not the point. And the point of even what I'm trying to deal with tonight has nothing to do with whether or not this is believable, unbelievable, true or not true. It has to do with what does the story show us? What is the story telling us? What is its point? And of course, one of the things that I began to discover as I began to allow my focus to shift from the things that drew my attention based on the theology that I was already trying to confirm, to trying to say, well, is it possible I can, and it's not, but can I try to at least form a blank slate with this piece of literature and let it speak for the very first time to me, completely aside from my expectations? And that's not an easy thing to do, but in fact, this is one of the reasons why I went back to school and even studied linguistic anthropology. I wanted to be able to take a look at the nature of language and look at its patterns, its regularities, and become aware of the kinds of structures that exist within human speech that indicate things that we tend to miss, or we tend to not realize are actually there all along. This is when I learned about things like indexicalities, when I learned about things such as how something can be understood within the text by something that was previously said or modified by something that will be said next, or how things that, and just exactly how human language structures such things, or how sometimes things about the historical context that may have been understood by the first readers of a particular text might exaphorically be able to make very clear to them what the text is saying. But those of us from the 21st century, we look at it and we go, well, what's going on here? And we're outside of a context and the information we really need isn't in the text. But it was in the culture at the time. And so by studying this aspect of linguistics, it helped me to come back at the text, looking at it with more of an aha, more of a skepticism, more of a, well, what are you really saying? And let me just forget about the theology I thought that I had understood. And one of the things that stood out to me very strongly when I started to do that was looking at the temptation of Jesus. I, for years, read that temptation of Jesus, and I saw Jesus having an opportunity to appease his hunger by the temptation of turning the stone into bread. And I would see his opportunity to display to the world his abilities, his powers, and the role that he plays with his Father in heaven by jumping off the pinnacle of the temple. And I also would see in the other temptation the fact that my theology had told me that Jesus came to win back the world. And therefore, if he would only bow down and worship Satan, how this would give to him his goal. And there's this temptation to achieve it by doing the wrong thing and worshiping Satan. And for years, this is the way I understood the temptations. But as I began looking back at it, I began to realize I was skipping over the introduction of every single temptation, just skipping over it as if it didn't have any relevance to the text. Or if it had any relevance to the text, it represented the doubting of Satan. But actually, I then began to see this in a very different light. Every temptation began with, if you are the Son of God, then command these stones that they be made bread. Now, the truth is, if Jesus were the Son of God, and if the Son of God had the power to speak to the stones that they become bread, then he could do that. He wouldn't even need to be tempted to do that. If he really needed the bread and he could provide that bread for himself in such a manner, then like a person who had the power of the force, he'd turn the stone into bread simply because he was hungry. But instead, we have a temptation here. And the temptation is this: if you are the Son of God. And what I began to see in this temptation, and the others, because they all begin with that same "if you are the Son," is Jesus is in this temptation being tempted to make who he is the issue. If we're going to take a look at this as a story without respect to whether or not it's true or not, we find Jesus coming as the representation of Abba, which, by the way, is not Yahweh. He comes as the representation of Abba, and I think I see him coming as someone who's here to kind of destroy the cult of Yahweh. He's not this other. He's not. It's just not the same thing. But anyway, so here's that issue. So he comes as the representation of Abba, but is this what he's supposed to do? In this story, I see these temptations, the recognition that who he is not the issue, can't be the issue, is irrelevant as an issue, and shouldn't be the issue. If he has come to do something, then it's time to do what he came to do. And proving who he is not what it's all about. Not only that, but I had already come to the point in myself where I realized, you can't do that. It's not possible to do. I mean, you can conclude it, maybe, but you can never nail this thing down to the ground. It's not possible to do. And since it's not possible to do, what a waste of time it would be to go about trying to do it. What a message it sends if you do try to do it. As a result, as I began to read through the various Gospels, I see Jesus not dodging the issue of if he is God because he's trying to keep people confused or because the text isn't clearly saying. I see instead Jesus dodging the issue because he's thinking, what's your hang up, people? Why is it you have to try to figure out who and what I am? Can't you just listen to what I'm telling you? Can't you just listen to what we're dealing with? Can't you just deal with the ugliness of this religion? Can't you just deal with the things we're trying to clearly show, the issues you can work with? Why do you have to figure out all this metaphysical stuff? Why is that so important? And so he dodges the issue. And I think that the text presents him as somebody who is, in a way that isn't even really clearly defined, a representation of God. And yet, being that representation of God is an issue he is trying to completely avoid because that has nothing to do with what he is attempting to accomplish. And it is a distraction. In fact, it was when I began to see that's when I realized just how dangerous religion can be, how abusive it can be, and why that kind of authority in the world is really very abusive. Because even if there really, 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 really is a God, anybody who could really, 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 really know that for really, 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 really certain would have to be a person who would turn that into an issue, and the kind of horrible things they would end up doing as a result of that, small as we are as people in a sense, that just would not be a good thing. It can't possibly be a worthwhile issue for anyone to make. And that's why I found myself coming to a point where, although I remain a theist, although I remain a person who does believe in Jesus, I don't see that as the point. And I don't see it as anything worth defending. And in fact, I don't believe I can prove it. I don't think that I have any right to even think that it can be proven. And I actually recognize that I could be totally wrong about that. And guess what? It doesn't matter because that's not the point. It is not the issue. And so although I remain that, there's a sense in which, and this is one of the reasons I love the New Covenant group, even though I am a theist, that's not the point. The truth is, I'm more a theist just because when I put it all together, that's where I experience the least amount of cognitive dissonance. That isn't a very powerful reason. Yeah, I know. But I can't deny the fact that there is within me this sense of the awareness of presence, and I can't deny these other things. So I don't know what to make of them, but I realize I can't make anything of them with any sort of certainty. So I don't care. It doesn't matter. But I look at the text and I begin to see even Jesus speaking in this manner where he has to go about being who he is in this story. And yet he has to see if he can provoke and push the buttons that he needs to provoke and push in terms of the issues that are important, while still trying to keep the issue of, well, just exactly who are you, something that is always able to escape becoming the main issue. For example, and I left off somewhere in Luke chapter 4 last time I was talking about this. And as I was looking at Luke chapter 5, I see there's a place here when Jesus he's looking to call some of his disciples, and in the way the text talks about it, he goes down to Gennesaret, and I suppose he's going to talk to some. Oh, let's see, who is he? He's going to talk to some of the people that were fishing there. I got to look at the text here. What it said, he's talking to Simon, who. He was after he was teaching the people from the boat, and of course Simon is a fisherman, and he says, "Put it down, or let down your nets for a catch." And Peter is like, "Oh, look, we've worked all night and we haven't caught anything. There's just no fish here. So I'll tell you what, though, since you insist, I'll do it." And he does it, and as a result, a great horde of fish are caught, so much so that it's weighing down the boat, endangering it into sinking. And and then the immediate reaction Peter has is, oh no, you look at this, he seems to somehow control the fish. And here I am, I'm a sinful man, and I must be now in the presence of God. And he says, depart from me because I'm a sinful. He becomes immediately uncomfortable. Now, I think it's important to point out here in the text that the text never states, and in this way, Jesus proved that he was God. It doesn't say that. It says that this happened. He told them to put the nets in, they bring this in, and it is Peter's reaction that he feels that this is going on, and he wants this to be his, actually he wants some distance from Jesus. And then Jesus said, because Peter's so afraid, I must be in the presence of God. And of course, Peter lives in a culture where people are taught that to be in the presence of someone who might be God is a very fearful thing. And Jesus kind of dismisses it. He says, don't be afraid. From now on, you will fish for people. And so Jesus is actually, in one fell swoop, dismissing the concept that who he is anything to be afraid of, or even really relevant. Okay, so we shook things up a bit. I got your attention. You know what? I got something far more. Making the fish appear for the one in the text here, who's the Son of God, is really a parlor trick. But I'll tell you what, dealing with human beings is not. But if you can trust that anything's going on here, I'll make you fishers of men. And of course, this all depends on what you mean. What are we going to catch them for? So anyway, they pulled the boats up on shore, and they left everything. So these people who had a profession of being fishermen pretty much all their lives, right up until now, their adult lives being fishermen, probably grew up in homes where dad was a fisherman and all that, are now prepared to drop all of that and to now follow Jesus. And they've gone through this experience where they're not sure just who this guy is. And yet, if this guy is somebody unusual, he doesn't seem to be wanting to make that the point, nor does he want us to possess the typical proper response to recognizing who he is. And so this has got to leave them, in some sense, a very confused state, which is, I think, where Jesus really wants them. He doesn't want them turning exactly who he is into the issue. The issue is there's people out there who need something, and you're going to be the people who are going to try to deliver that. Anyway, we do have a okay, I'm reading this viewer comment. It says, maybe Peter was trying to get Jesus to go away so we wouldn't have to share all the fish. That is awesome. I love that. By the way, when you're reading a text, you really do have to consider all the possibilities, and I suppose that's one. And we'd certainly have to eliminate it. Maybe, we could make the argument, I guess, that Simon Peter is, after all, a capitalist, and he makes his living by fishing, and now he's got a whole ton of fish, and apparently at the responsibility of somebody else, and so he feigns this need for distance so that he can keep all the fish for himself, which might be an interesting argument, except that in the next paragraph or so, he actually drops fishing altogether, and as far as we can tell, left all the fish in the boat. Ooh, stinky. I can't imagine what would have happened there. Maybe, hopefully, people just came along and grabbed the fish freely available to them, and in this way, Jesus actually fed a lot of people that day who just came and took the spoils that were abandoned. But that is funny. I like that. You go away so you wouldn't have to share the fish. It is true, though, that there are many people who are like that. That they can do. I remember it was that the comedian Smirnoff. I love the guy. If I'm thinking of the right guy, he's the guy whose his big line for a long time was "What a country," And I remember when he was naturalized, he came from Russia, and he finally went through the process of becoming a United States citizen. And the very day that he became a citizen, he was on Johnny Carson that night, and I saw him on Johnny Carson, and so Johnny Carson, he said, so. When you became a citizen, what was the first thing that entered your mind after becoming a United States citizen? And he said something like, we have to stop all of these foreigners coming into this country and taking our jobs. I thought, it was a funny thing for him to say, but it was that kind of now that he's in the position of advantage, as it were, to switch his ploy, the things he's talking about. Anyway, I see that in Jesus, I see this person in this story being developed where Jesus is presented in this story as being somebody who does represent Abba, who is not like everybody else. And because he's not like everybody else, he can't be like everybody else. And he's going to be doing things that are different from the way anybody else would do it. But he's also trying to do it in a manner where the fact that he is different from everybody else isn't even relevant to what it is we need to get done. And there's a sense here in which I see in the story of the gospel, Jesus constantly maintaining a relationship with his disciples, a relationship wherein he behaves in a manner that is totally contrary in many ways to what you would expect of the Messiah. And yet, there are other things he does that would seem to indicate he is messianic. And this strikes me as being within these stories, at least the way the story is presented, the point of this particular aspect of the theme. One of the reasons why we even have various different cultic theological arguments where people saying, well, the text definitely is asserting and showing us that Jesus claims to be God, and other people come along, no, the text definitely shows that he's denying it. And what I see instead is I see a text where Jesus is trying to turn the identity of who he is into something that is a non-issue. Now, when we say it's a non-issue, this doesn't mean that it isn't true or that it is true. Nor does it mean that it doesn't have any value. In fact, later, it's not until much, much later that we find Jesus, but this is like in his third year of ministry and close to the time that he was about ready to be murdered. It's not until then that Jesus even deals with the question when it comes to his disciples. He said, who do people say that I am? And some people say you're a prophet. Some people say you're the Christ. Some people say you're John the Baptist or some other prophet, and some say you're Elijah. And Jesus asks them, he says, well, who do you say that I am? And this is when Peter just blurts it out. He goes, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Now, Jesus was very pleased with that. But I got to tell you that when I look at that, I also find that those words, they don't mean what you think they mean. In fact, what they do mean is almost indiscernible. The Christ being an anointed one. Well, what's an anointed person? Throughout that's what the word literally means, the anointed one. Even in that culture, to be anointed did not necessarily mean anything magical. Didn't necessarily mean that. It could be used even in a sense. You're in the right place at the right time to do what it is you're here to do. It could be something that loose, or it could be something that you are the one chosen for the hour. The word does not possess that level of certainty. It's got a wider domain of meaning. You are the Christ. Then he says, the Son of the living God. Even here, when Jesus had spoken many times, he said, "Yeah, haven't you read that you're all, you're all sons of God?" That this term is also quite, I would hope that by the time we get to it, quite undefined. And there's a sense here when I read that confession of Peter, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. There's almost a sense in which Jesus has gotten with Peter to the point where Peter can now make this assertion of identifying Jesus in a manner that absolutely makes no sense. And that doesn't really say anything specific, even though our theology has turned it into something radically specific. I don't see it in the context in which it's occurring in the text as representing something that is a very, very specific confession. I see it as Peter recognizing, boy, there's something unusual going on with you, and it's definitely going on with you. And you've come here to represent God, and you have done that. But that doesn't necessarily mean that these people, there's a sense in which Jesus is not necessarily even saying that he's any different from anybody else. In fact, there's many times, the things I've done, greater things will you do. And a lot of people read that. We see Jesus did miracles, and that means you're going to do greater miracles. You know what? Maybe those parlor tricks aren't anywhere near as important as letting people know that their dignity as human beings is important. Maybe that's nowhere near as important as letting people know you don't need religion. You don't need this cult of Yahweh. You don't need these religious authorities in your life pushing you about this way and that way. It is possible for you to be a person who can even commune with God, and you don't even have to do that in a way where what anybody else thinks about God or how anybody else defines God even makes any bit of difference. So there's a sense here in which, as I'm looking at the story, I begin to see a different paradigm that is truly present, as I see it in the text, that cuts across the grain of the paradigm we have injected upon this text, so that as I'm looking at it, I discover that I find some of the same things that speak to that same conundrum that I found myself in, unable to make it clear in any manner as to just what it is going on. It sounds like we do have another viewer comment. Why do you think that Jesus affirmed Peter's confession that he was the Christ? Well, first of all, I think it would be important to point out that I think that the way Peter said it and what those words meant was so non-distinct and so non-specific. What does it mean to be the Christ? We don't know. So therefore, because we don't know what that means, there's no problem in turning it into an issue because we just don't know what it means. And I think that it is also something that in the story, as we see it here, that is true in this story. And so I think Jesus is pleased that Peter can now express it in a way that gives it all the non-distinctness that it is worthy of. Whereas very different from his first confession being, depart from me because I am just a sinful man. He's got this at a point where, in fact, what is Peter's reaction after he says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God? Is he ready to run away? Is he intimidated by this? Is it even an issue? Does it change how he relates to what Jesus says or does? I think we see that we finally gotten to the point where in this story, the nature of who Jesus is not the point. And Peter is now at a point where if he can see who Jesus really is and see that in a manner that doesn't make any difference to what really is important right now, that Peter has really come to a point of realizing something that is very useful. And to be honest with you, in a sense, I, as a person who does believe in God, I have sought thereby also to develop a sense of faith and theology where it doesn't matter. It isn't the point. It has nothing to do with what we need to be doing here. It hasn't anything to do with, when we talk about true religion, visiting the widows, and the prisoners, the people who are ill, and the taking care of people who need comfort, feeding the hungry. Now we can feed the hungry, not because it's a wonderful spiritual and great thing for us to be doing, and what wonderful people we are for being so sensitive and empathetic about starving people that we would actually put forth an effort to give to them. Why don't we feed people hungry because they're hungry? Why don't we help people who need help because, they need help? Why don't we do this where even though we ourselves as believers might believe that this is something that God would have us do, why don't we do it as if the fact that God would have us do this has nothing to do with it? It's totally irrelevant. Why not just look at people for who they are and love them for who they are? And the fact that you might explain this within your own mind, that, well, we're all made in God's image. We have the dignity of the image of God within us. Wonderful that that's an explanation that you can rely on and maybe a metaphor you can live in. But it's not the point. It has nothing to do with what we need to do or who needs it done and why it would be a good idea for us to do it. It is completely irrelevant. And I think that I can see this in the text in this way. So I would say that, at least in terms of the story presented in the text, Jesus accepts this confession by Peter because in the story that's the truth. But I think he accepts it from Peter when Peter can finally put it in a way that where it just doesn't really make any difference. It turns an ability to see who Jesus is, first of all, in a way that's very nonspecific. And secondly, in a way that it's so nonspecific that, well, what do we do with that now? Becomes, I don't know. I can't think of anything. And I think that we see later, even after that confession, I think we see Peter struggling with what to do with that. And he's not struggling very well with it. And I think I see Jesus rejecting in Peter the things that Peter's trying to do with it, as a way of saying, look, Peter, okay, so this was a wonderful moment. You came to this moment of equilibrium where it didn't make any difference. Now you're trying to turn it into something that makes a difference. Stop it. Get behind me, Satan. The very next thing that happens after that confession is Peter begins to want to protect Jesus from anything bad ever happening to him. He's just look, in a sense, there's this like saying, you are not here to protect my good name. As a person who believes in Jesus, I'm not here to make sure that Jesus has a good reputation in the world or that things are going to go well for him. That's not the point. It's not the purpose. It isn't even what God cares about. People don't have to believe in him. They don't even have to have good thoughts about him. But I tell you what, we do need to love each other. We do need to be kind to one another. We do need to be empathetic. We do need to be together. And we need to be honest to the degree that we can be. We need to be, we need to become the people we can become, and the community we can be, for reasons that are very valuable and meaningful to us as a community. And just who and what God is in all of that is not really the point, and can't be allowed to be the point. I can't allow there to be a difference between us and them simply because there is a belief or not a belief in Jesus. I'll tell you what, when people who believe in God or people who don't believe in God experience the death of somebody close to them, they need somebody who cares about their pain, understands that this hurts, and understands that we really don't know what comes after death. None of us who are alive have ever been there. The need for that hour is identical in many respects simply because of the human condition. And I think that I see in this a theme that I see Jesus really working towards, and I see religion destroying, because I would see that in the New Testament, that after Jesus has, in my opinion, successfully destroyed this religious mentality, this sin mindfulness mentality, this whole concept that there's even anything to worry about mentality when it comes to man and God, it slowly sifts back into just the cult of Yahweh 2.0, now becoming the cult of Jesus. And that, it's like, I can see some places where Jesus even gets frustrated in some of the Gospels, where Jesus says, how long am I going to be with you guys? You don't get it. You're trying to turn this into something where the magic is the point. You're trying to turn this into something where who I am is the point. You're trying, how about making who you are and who other people are and what life is? How about making that the point? How about focusing there? I see in a sense that as Jesus being this representation of God, as the text would present it, as being, there's a sense in which there's only one thing you can do with God, and that is be mindful of the possibility, conscious of the presence, encouraged by it perhaps. But what can you make of it? What can you do with it? Nothing. There's nothing you need to do with it. Then there's plenty of other things you need to do and can do, and it would be good to do, that should be done, can be done, and will be done if you do them, for reasons that have to have nothing to do with whether or not God is God. And so I do see in the text here this theme coming out, as I understand it, where although Jesus is presented in the text as a representation of Abba, the fact that he is in the text presented that way is also something which is needing to be irrelevant. There is a sense in which certainty about God is something that man in his current condition does not need to be certain about, and doesn't handle very well when he thinks he is. And I think in some ways that's the point that I get from this. And so therefore, I find myself a believer, but I found myself being a person who can't make that the issue. And we have one more comment here. Oh, and the comment here is one about time. Nonetheless, so I've come to a certain point here where, let me just take the text a little bit further, and hopefully this won't take more than 5 minutes. In the very next section of Luke here, where I was at in chapter 5, Jesus ends up healing a paralyzed man. And he does it by saying to him, "Friends, your sins are forgiven." Now, Jesus says this. Why would he say that? I think that it makes it clear in the text that the reason Jesus says that, he's trying to provoke the religious people, who are very much provoked by it. They're going, oh, the teachers of the law and the Pharisees, they begin to say, who is this guy who speaks blasphemy? Who can forgive sin but God alone? And by the way, the word blasphemy there means, a person who's slow to appreciate and understand what is really true. And so basically they're looking at Jesus as somebody who just doesn't get it as to what the reality of Yahweh really is. And although he's up there pretending to be some sort of a teacher and some sort of a leader, he's now doing something as absurd as telling people their sins are forgiven. And Jesus comes back, he says, why are you thinking these things? Which is easier to say, your sins are forgiven, or to say, get up and walk? Jesus, in a sense, he's saying, it doesn't make any difference. I said something to him, he gets up, he walks. What does it matter what I said to him? But it did matter that he said what he said, because he intended to provoke them. This is another way in which Jesus is demonstrating that you guys are going to get confused. Because first of all, this guy apparently, according to the story, does get up and walk. Now, what do you do with that? But at the same time, he does it in a manner that provokes them with a sense of blasphemy in confronting the things that were thought to be true about Yahweh. So Jesus is maintaining this conundrum where he's really driving it home to a point where he tries to make sure that if he's going to do something unusual, he also does it in a way that will offend the religious. That's amazingly brilliant when you look at the strategy of it in terms of the story here. What a wonderful way to do it. If I were to write a novel, I would no matter what that novel was about, I would love it if the hero of the story could do certain things that both establish who he really is, but antagonize the people who already have a clear-cut sense of just what it is he ought to do, in a manner that I don't know whether to. I mean, it's kind of like, what if you met somebody who at one time was helping you straighten out a lot of the problems you had, but at the other time is also confronting you about issues that you are very uncomfortable with and don't want to face? Do you run away from people who are confronting you about things you're uncomfortable with? What if they're also solving problems for you? What do you do that? You see, you're caught in this tension. It's a catch-22. In some sense, you feel like you're getting a hug, and other times you're getting a punch. You're not really sure what to do with it, and you're going to have to figure this conundrum out or come to a point where something happens. And, of course, this did come to a point where something happened. They murdered him. But anyway, this is the kind of tension that I see Jesus involved in. And I see this constantly being developed in the text. And of course, it brought me to this point where I really began to see that the point of Jesus, certainly not the point of the people who translate it, certainly not the point of the people who have developed this thing we call Western Christianity. But it appears to me that, at least in its original form, that this story was one where that part of it was something Jesus was trying to turn into the non-issue, and he was doing it by confronting the authority of Yahweh with a different authority, while at the same time saying this isn't about authority. Not an easy thing to do. I can't imagine the task, but nonetheless, that's the theme that I seem to get out of this. Anyway, that's about all. That's about really all I have to say, and all I need to talk about tonight. I hope it was interesting, amusing to you, and help share with you a little bit about how my thinking has really evolved and changed in this, away from a very fundamentalist kind of concept. Anyway, so Bob Greaves, the Unconventional Pastor. I will see you on Wednesday with Phil, and I'm going to see you next week with the author of this book here, a good friend of mine, Ken McIntosh, who just wrote this book recently, and he wants to talk to me about it, and I'm looking forward to that. So thank you so much. We'll catch you later.
I'd like to welcome you to the place. This is the place for intellectual, spiritual, and scriptural honesty. You know, I'm really troubled about several things. I find so many people looking at the New Covenant group and they're saying, wow, if you can answer all of my questions, I might come your way and actually become a student. What university do you go to? And you say, well, if you can teach me everything about the circulatory system first, I might enroll in your school. That's not reasonable. You know, just the simple thing that I've stated, that all of the law, all of the Old Testament can't be proven as the Word of God, that alone should be enough reason why everyone should be knocking on our doors. Why? Because there are no persons alive in any place that can prove that any of these books of the Old Testament actually came from God. Now, if you want to stay in a system that says, these are the words of God, we can't prove it, stay there. But if you want proof, you might have to say, I might need to leave those places and go find some place where they wrestle with things a little bit more honestly. Because to go through the entire system of everything that we teach, it takes years. It's not an overnight game. This is about good people becoming honest, stepping up to the plate and saying, you know, you've said enough to get me thinking. I want to taste and see the rest of it. And please understand, I want to be brutally honest with myself. Because if I'm not, I'm probably not good. And it's true that evil will probably arise in my neighborhood because I'm not good. If your neighborhood is bad, it's probably because you're not doing anything. When good people start doing good things in their neighborhoods change. We can't go to our politicians and expect for America to be good. We've got to become good people in order for America to be good. That changes everything. Let's not wait for a politician to get elected for things to be good. If the economic things are bad, and they are, it's only because good people are not stepping up to the plate. People need to come to the New Covenant group, get a good education, start being honest, start stepping up to the plate, and let's start growing. And I'm inviting you to the conversation. I'm inviting you to a place that has some sanity, a place that has enough courage to question, a place in which we can be good, and a place where evil is pushed out the front door. Would you come?
I get so much email bashing me for being ever so inclusive. I love atheists. I'm not wanting atheists to come our way simply for me to give them a lesson in theology. I want atheists to come my way so that I can give them an ear. They deserve to speak. They deserve to be listened to. They deserve my love. They deserve my protection. They deserve my support. They deserve everything that I can give them in a wonderful context. And so my wife and I are very, very confident and sold on the idea of love being unconditional and acceptance being unconditional. When you're facing a person who has a daughter or possibly a son, a loved one who is suffering so much, and you can actually help them. Here you are, you're the physician, and you can help them, and your disciples are claiming you're only sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Let's not take care of anyone outside of the context of Israel. How can you be so insensitive to those who are in pain? How can you be so insensitive to those who are construed to be outside of the household of Israel? I'm asking for someone to be intellectually honest. I don't care what the rest of the Bible says. Put the book down for a moment and start thinking for yourself. Own your own responsibility. Ask yourself, just say, self, is it right for a parent to crush any child? Is that good? Some people would argue, well, you're not understanding the significance of this theologically. I beg to differ. If you want to debate theologically, just give me a call. I'll give it to you.
I don't believe that you're a Christian from the things that you've said today.
So you're not going to say, you're not going to shake my hand?
I will. I will.
Not as a Christian.
I will, but I want to get my piece out first.
See, the church says we deserve this kind of punishment. I deserve to be beaten beyond recognition. I deserve to be pierced. If I'm sick, someone needs to die. Come on. I'm simply asking you to be intellectually honest. I can't get people to be scripturally honest because if I say, hey, the Greek and the Hebrew really doesn't suggest X, Y, or Z, they're going to argue with me because they love their English versions. So let's talk about your theology for a while.
You can't give it to me.
Because I don't understand what you're saying.
You don't have a clue as to what I'm saying, and you're trying to tell me about some spurious idea that they inserted hell and God's going to burn people for eternity. Anyone who spins the idea of repentance is illiterate, very illiterate. Is that clear enough?
It's very clear, sir.
Very clear.
Just because an ancient said, this is what God said, doesn't mean that God said any of it. Think for yourself. Get outside of that box of saying, oh, the ancients heard from God, but God is not willing to talk to me, but he's willing to talk to the ancients. God's willing to talk to the ancients, but he's not willing to talk to you. Something's upside down with that mindset, because Christians are afraid of truth. Christians are afraid to be honest about the ills of killing someone and calling it good. Every year I have to be sickened by so many people who are claiming, oh, it's great to have this torture symbol in my face, reminding me year after year after year how cruel we were. If we are following Yahweh, I don't blame people for walking away. I'm going to give them an applause. Walk away from Yahweh. He's not worth serving. He's not worth worshiping. In fact, his morals are corrupt. Walk away. Love doesn't create distance, but the church does. I keep encouraging people to leave church because it creates distance. When is it ever right to beat someone beyond recognition? And boy, did I get a lesson. I heard all kinds of reasons why we should be beating people beyond recognition. It was amazing. I heard people actually defending the doctrine of beating someone beyond recognition. And I said, this is 2013. What's happening to religious people? Why are people getting so intoxicated with religion that they can't see that this is immoral? And it was Eric Coven, by the way. He said, what motivates you to do good? I said, that's simple. That's so simple. Hell doesn't motivate me to do good. We were talking about whether hell existed or not. I said, it doesn't. I said, what motivates me to love what motivates me to do good to my wife? It's called love. What motivates me to be faithful to her? It's called love. It's that simple. It's not complex. This is the university that we all need to attend. Once you start realizing what love is, kindness is, patience is, you're going to find that you can say no with me to the crucifixion. I'd like to welcome you to the place. This is the place for intellectual, spiritual, and scriptural honesty.
Boom, 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 boom. Vocal solo. Joey, why must you tease me so? I don't know. Do you know that you do the voodoo that you do with your size 9 shoe? Why don't you take a walk on over here? His name is Joey. Joey L. There is no hell. Joey L, ladies and gentlemen. Oh, good. That was called the There Is No Hell, Joey L. Etude in C minor. This one's called Dr. Jones' Spicy Meatball. I like to play it in E minor, the funkiest of all keys. Although it does have an A dominant in it. If you don't know what an A dominant is, it dominates the chord structure. Look up your music theory.